Hello everyone, welcome to Beau Theory, where we tie everything together in a beautiful infinity bow. My name is Beau Theory. In my last video, I created a visual primer for how to think about celestial bodies colliding, as articulated by Beau Theory. I did this because I know what I'm describing is very difficult to imagine without visuals, let alone believe or digest. In this installment, I'm going to give a straightforward theoretical outline of my primary thesis and the most important and provable implications of Beau theory. My primary thesis is a new way of thinking about the creation of the Earth and Moon, as well as how plate tectonics and the lunar mare came into being. Both of these have remained shrouded in mystery and debate for centuries, until now. This was a magma ocean, due to this type of rotational spin as the moon approached the Earth. Beau theory has much larger implications in many more fields of science and history than I can include in one video. So this video will focus primarily on the Earth and Moon formation process, the evidence for my argument, and the main hypotheticals that follow. This evidence has the potential to rewrite Earth's history, a great many scientific theories as well. And either way, my findings are both compelling and intriguing, and so whether my conclusions are correct or not, they warrant further attention and examination by experts and amateur observers who can prove, disprove, or improve on my ideas. Specifically, I wish to address this video towards two of the leading astrophysicists of moon formation theory. Dr. Robin Canup of the Southwest Research Institute here in Boulder, where I actually live as well, and Dr. Sarah Stewart of UC Davis. Both of these brilliant women have given us immense insight into the formation of the moon, and both have deeply influenced my work. My primary thesis may potentially complement either of their theories, but it may also challenge them. It really depends on how much of what I'm theorizing is correct. If either of you see this video and are interested in speaking with me more about these ideas, I would be honored to get your feedback and input. There are several ways to interpret this evidence, so let me get to explaining it and why I interpret it as I do. This is the simplest iteration of Beau theory and the easiest to accept because it makes the most intuitive sense. Further elaborations on this theory may or may not be tenable to all my viewers, and so if I lose anybody, I won't be surprised. Let me begin with my basic conclusion. I believe I have found evidence that the moon directly shaped the Earth's surface and crustal boundaries while in low orbit during the early days of the Earth and Moon's formations, and that this process can be traced, tracked, and quantified using the lunar mares and craters to offer great insights into many fields of science. No one really thinks about how the moon escaped low Earth orbit to reach its current distance. However, all the models suggest that the moon would have periodically approached and moved away from the Earth as its orbit was rounded out. Beau theory proposes a coherent mechanism for how that process shaped the Earth and Moon's surfaces. This idea is supported by recent findings that the moon's magnetic field was once 50 times its current strength during its early days. A recent theory that perhaps the moon and Earth shared an atmosphere at one point, and the most recent reports of lunar water, which in truth greatly upsets the giant impact hypothesis in a pretty fundamental way, due to its model assuming that no volatile chemicals should be possible on the lunar surface in the wake of the extremely high temperatures necessary in a giant impact. For those unfamiliar with lunar formation theories, the leading theory is that a Mars-sized planetoid in the early solar system crashed into the Earth, and the debris from this impact then accreted into the moon. This is called the giant impact hypothesis, and it's been the accepted model of moon formation for about 50 years. This is because scientists believe it's the only way to account for the identical oxygen isotopes in the Earth and Moon's composition. However, there are many questions and variables that remain unresolved within this theory, and in recent years, more and more chemical evidence has challenged the core assumptions of this theory. I'm not going to get into all that here, but it's important to note that everyone involved in lunar formation theory admits there are lots of unanswered questions due to the conflicting evidence. So, my intuition tells me that the models that we are envisioning are incorrect in a fundamental way due to this contradiction. Every model I've seen of the giant impact hypothesis shows a Theia careening in at Earth on a straight line, with both planets being shattered as a result. And something about that always struck me as odd or somehow oversimplistic. And what I think is missing is a lack of spin for the proposed incoming Theia. To say it more precisely, the direction of Theia's axis of spin would have become more perpendicular to Earth's relative to its proximity to Earth. That is to say, the closer Theia got to Earth, the more likely its spin would have been reorientated towards Earth's gravity center. However, that's not to say that it would have approached Earth in a more direct kind of way that would have completely destroyed them both. Now, the models of a Mars-sized Theia impactor are predicated on this occurring with perfect conditions for a low-velocity, oblique impact. Dr. Canup, however, has wisely used her imagination to propose additional giant impact scenarios, and has been testing them in supercomputer simulations. In 2012, she proposed two equally sized bodies colliding, then coalescing and recolliding. Additionally, Cook and Stewart considered a moon-sized impactor and an Earth-sized Earth. I'm not sure the type of spin I'm describing has been factored in or tested into any of these models. In Dr. Stewart's slide, she talks about how Cook and Stewart tested a scenario with an Earth-sized Earth and a moon-sized moon in a head-on collision. However, I'm not sure they considered a more iron-dense spinning moon in this orientation, and it appears they modeled the moon coming in hot and fast, then impacting and being destroyed. In at least Dr. Canup's same-sized Earth-Theia collision model, she specifically describes a scenario with no spin and similar orbits, which makes sense depending on their densities. However, if they were equal densities, I find it difficult to believe that they would actually impact each other, so this presents another avenue for their surface plasmification, as demonstrated by this grape experiment in a microwave. But does it for a moon-sized object that is actually the same size, but is perhaps much more iron-dense than our moon is today? Why do I wonder about this? Let me show you what I found about the dark spots on the moon, also known as the lunar mares, and what I hypothesize they indicate. The evidence I've found indicates that the lunar mares were actually the focal points of a series of close encounters with the Earth's surface while it was still only partially coalesced. The two leading theories of lunar mare formation are comet-sized impacts from the debris of the giant impact, or lunar volcanism, or some combination of the two. I propose that a process of lunar surface plasmification during multiple near-Earth approaches offers a more coherent explanation for lunar mares and eliminates the incongruities and problems inherent in both the leading mare formation theories. These approaches, or impacts as I will refer to them, shape the lunar mares due to the nature of the moon's perpendicular to surface spin while approaching the Earth. Mare size thus correlates to how close the moon got to the Earth's surface. The mare impact would have likely occurred during a more direct approach than Dr. Canup envisioned, with the result being that contact between the Earth and Moon appears to have been forestalled by the electromagnetic forces released. These forces both push the Moon away as well as cause the Moon to shed mass. Combined with the intense heat of the near approach and the plasmification of the lunar surface, the intense plasma lightning arcs between the Earth and Moon would have served as a lever to eject mass from the Moon into space. As we see in strong repetitive ground-based lightning events, these types of discharges emanate from the same spot on Earth for many seconds. During lightning, power is transferred as waves of energy, or what we would think of as bolt flashes. So imagine the strongest lightning you've ever seen and multiply it by 1,000. Those are the kind of energy exchanges I am describing emanating from singular points on Earth to singular points on the Moon. This process of plasma lightning exchanges is thus what created most of the craters on the Moon. And this is why craters are found across the Moon, but rarely on the lunar mares. I theorized that all the moon's ray craters were actually caused by different tidal locking events, and that their rays actually indicate the result of plasma arc strikes. This would explain why we find rays instead of typical circular debris characteristic of real impacts. I theorize these encounters occurred while spinning inward from a tidally locked position. In all likelihood, both the Earth and Moon were tidally locked to each other during these encounters. That is to say, the same side of the Earth would have faced the same side of the Moon as well at all times. I am not proposing a determinate length of time for any of these tidal lockings. The close encounters were in fact an evolving relationship, with stages of stalling in place. In essence, the Moon was bouncing around on the Earth's still semi-molten, highly charged ionic surface, possibly within its early atmosphere, as it coalesced and struggled its way into orbit. It may be hard to imagine, but this occurred at a time when the Moon appeared at least 20 times larger in the sky. It's also evident that this locking occurred many times and in many places in those early days. Alternatively, it is also plausible that this process occurred at a time when Earth was spinning much faster, having perhaps as short as a 2-hour day, as Dr. Stewart has imagined. In such a scenario, 4 impressions could have been made in as short as 8 hours. If this didn't occur while the Earth was tidally locked to the Moon, then in all likelihood, this process occurred in what could be called the time before time. The length of days, months, and probably even years were all very different than today. If this occurred while the Moon's orbit was still more parabolic, however, it's very easy to imagine a moon getting closer and further away. It could have easily become plasmified on parts of its surface at its closest approach, and cooled each time as it moved to a more distant part of its orbit. In any case, there is substantial evidence of multiple impressions for each mare when turned in different directions at each impact location. This indicates that they would have either been at least close to a mutually tidally locked configuration during each of these approaches, or they occurred very fast. I think the most reasonable explanation for these so-called impacts is that they actually occurred at the Roche limit, where the tidal forces of Earth's gravity would have begun tearing the Moon apart. But through the process that I'll outline in this presentation, it didn't actually continue past that, but somehow bounced off the Roche limit and created impact impressions. Of course, this close in orientation is implausible according to physics. The Roche limit is 6,000 miles and approximately Earth's diameter, and so if they were equal sized, you can imagine an imaginary third sphere between them as their Roche limit, and you could plausibly get a plasma vortex resonance between them. This belies the fact that gravity is not very well understood, and the recent work of scientists in the electric universe who have tied gravity and electricity together, which may very well change the way we think about the density of the Earth and Moon as they approached. During these events, the Moon would have shed matter, causing crustal loss and gravity sinks that eventually lightened the Moon's mass enough for it to escape low Earth orbit. The places where significant amounts of crust were blown away then eventually settled into the lunar mares. The only impressions of electromagnetic discharges left on the mares are the echoes of much larger exchanges that occurred from these crater points, repetitively over time. The only way to deduce this is by examining multiple layers of moon maps. However, due to the inherent torus vortex pattern of this energy exchange, the shadow of the process can still be seen and reconstructed because the pattern is actually inherent throughout the universe. My contention is that the forces generated from the Moon approaching caused massive electromagnetic energy to rise from within the Earth that then burst outward at the surface, subsequently creating these volcanoes and mountains, as well as giant plasma arcs that deflected the Moon. These helped to slow the Moon's descent towards Earth and to divert the direction of the Moon's spin away from impacting. The effect of the Earth-directed material from the Moon would have acted like a thruster, and the effect of periphery ejected material would have been similar to the effects of the yo-yo D-spin technique used by rocket scientists to slow a rocket's trajectory in space. Assuming these massive plasma lightning strikes would have went both ways to and from the Earth, I further postulate this would better explain the true origin of complex craters on the Moon, such as Copernicus. For those unfamiliar, complex craters have mountains in the middle of them, sometimes as much as a mile or more high. which seems completely illogical from a common sense point of view. But it makes perfect sense if they are actually created by lunar plasma discharges and strikes. It appears that many of the world's major river systems flow from the epicenters of these lunar approaches, and it seems likely that the plasma lightning from the moon may have initially carved out these river channels. The shape and direction of these river channels actually offers immense insight into the direction of the moon's trajectory during its approaches. However, one must factor in the shifting crust and equator and movements of the plates over time to really see that pattern. Therefore, it is not what I consider part of the simple iteration of Beau theory. I want to make sure my viewers are aware that many of Earth's other mysterious land formations have been recreated from plasma discharges in the lab on a small scale. For example, the haunting mesas of the American Southwest and river patterns, as well as lunar crater shapes, are easily recreated by plasma discharges in the lab. So now that I've explained the basic theory, let me explain how I discovered it and show you my findings. This was all deduced by working backwards. About a year ago, I discovered the end of this story, the point from which the moon finally left low Earth orbit. At first, I must admit, I was incredibly skeptical that what I had found was even remotely possible. I spent a lot of time not talking to anyone about it while I considered different scenarios. Over time, though, I traced the moon's behavior and movements via the Lunar mare, then stepped back to consider the entire Oceanus Procellarum as a whole when I discovered NASA's combined fault line and Grail gravity map. My evidence is drawn from an extensive examination of the lunar surface and mare, with specific focus on the Oceanus Procellarum, its craters, and the newly discovered fault lines that surround it. This work recently revealed far more proof of my original thesis than I could have ever expected, and it was upon this mountain of new evidence that I decided to offer up my theory for review. I am releasing this theory now so that its inconsistencies may be illuminated by my peers. The evidence I see is so overwhelming the skeptic in me needs more questions to preclude this being simply confirmation bias. My method of discovery was to follow Einstein's method for discovering the theory of relativity, that of playing out imaginary scenarios in my head in order to seek out logical solutions for how things behave relative to each other. I then postulated corroborating physical evidence and sought evidence to confirm or deny my ideas. I think of it as old school intuitive deduction. The evidence of this is as astounding as it is apparent. Most clearly, the topographical features of the Oceanus Procellarum correlate to either the earliest or the final stage of the Earth-Moon formation process that occurred over the Pacific Ocean. In the following description, wherever I refer to lunar craters, I am primarily referring to craters within the Oceanus Procellarum and those adjacent to the lunar mares. I put craters in quotes because, as stated, I theorize they are not primarily impact craters from asteroids, but actually discharge craters from massive plasma exchanges between the Earth and Moon. So what's the evidence? The new evidence comes from the moon's gravity map, with data gathered by NASA's 2012 Grail mission, combined with its fault line map. This combined image was released in 2018, so this is very new stuff, and I'm sure not many of you have had a chance to ponder it. However, I believe this mission was named the Grail for a reason. When this map is overlaid over a map of the Pacific Plate, the pattern of correspondence between Earth and Moon fault systems and topography becomes clearly evident. I intuitively sense that the shapes of both fault systems of the Earth and Moon were quite similar some time ago. However, because I was outlining the end of the Earth-Moon formation process, I didn't actually examine the two maps side by side until just recently. Also, due to the different sizes of the Earth and Moon, I dismissed this idea as inconsequential. However, when I really looked at them, what I found blew my mind in the same way that my original revelation had a year ago. Not only do the shapes of both fault line systems match to an astounding degree when overlaid, the pattern matches when the moon is turned in 4 different directions. It is, in essence, the same shape when turned in 4 directions. The directions are south, west, north, and northeast. Having found this symmetry, I next began exploring crater to island symmetry in the overlaid maps and found a great deal more corroborating evidence. Beyond the symmetry and shape between fault lines, there is extensive correspondence between the raised islands of the Pacific Ocean and lunar craters on the moon. This is true when these maps are overlaid and examined in all 4 directions, though not for all islands in all orientations. The second, and the most important symmetry between the Earth and Moon topography, is a central vortex spin pattern at the very middle of their fault systems. On the Moon, the crater Copernicus appears very near the center of the lunar mare and fault line map, and in fact, it is at the center of the entire Oceanus Procellarum. On Earth, we find the same pattern at Fiji and Samoa. They are very near the center of the Pacific Plate and also demonstrate this circular vortex pattern if we examine the maps of nearby ocean topography. This evidence indicates to me that these locations were the major focal point of connection between the Earth and Moon in their early days, as they both spun in place around this axis. If one places the central lunar crater of Copernicus over the central Pacific islands of Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, and Kiribati, many of the other craters on the Oceanus Procellarum line up precisely with islands on Earth, as do the fault lines around the Pacific. Accepting that this is not a static linear relationship is essential to understanding how this evolved over time. We must think in terms of spin and bounces, or waves and altitude. As previously acknowledged, the total areas within the fault line systems of the Moon and Earth are not actually equal, so admittedly, this still raises several important questions. However, none of them really preclude the symmetry of electromagnetic vortex patterns being scalable. In fact, the pattern that emerges is fractal, and therefore it may be found at multiple layers and scales at once and at different directions, and is reflected throughout the cosmos. In each direction the map of the Moon is turned, one of the above-mentioned islands marks the center and corresponds to Copernicus on the Moon. Many islands, in fact, show up repeatedly in alignments with lunar craters, even after turning. For example, Hawaii aligns to a lunar crater in at least 3 directions. Due to this difference in size between the Earth and Moon, the correspondence between fault lines may seem coincidental. It certainly doesn't follow the pattern of exact correspondence found in individual lunar mares, and so, as I admit, it raises many questions. It could indicate the relative distance of the Moon, but it could also indicate an originally larger Moon. More intriguingly, it could also point to a place and mechanism supporting a reevaluation of George Darwin's discredited Earth-Moon fission thesis. Which is a stretch, I know, but I have given it some thought. And while I'm no fan of tomfoolery, if we take these Dutch scientists at their word that they have discovered a mechanism of using nuclear fission to divide the Earth from the Moon, we may actually be able to tie together many moon formation theories as different stages of this entire process, beginning with 2 near equally sized plasma balls colliding with each other, one of them whittling the other one down. At this point, I am still exploring this idea of it being both or either the first and last point of tidal locking, and I welcome others' feedback on this idea. This may be confusing, but either scenario seems plausible to me. Therefore, I continue to theorize regarding which is correct, or whether it actually could in fact be both. This line of inquiry leads into a discussion of the Moon's original origin, which is a much larger discussion, and I only want to have it after this part of my theory has been vetted and considered. In any case, it seems plausible if this was the last place of their tidally locked connection. The Moon leaving low Earth still could have been capable of producing the electromagnetic effects necessary to shape these fault line systems on both bodies. An earlier connection between these points does seem more plausible to me, but I don't want to get into that. In examining this incredible evidence that clearly points to a specific process, I see 2 main viable conclusions. The first is that this same pattern represents the internal process of all celestial body formations, as an outward emanation from their cores. This vortex pattern could have coincidentally emerged on both surfaces during their plasma stage of creation. If this was true, we could find the same predictable process and pattern throughout the cosmos. And we do find a similar hexagonal pattern at Saturn's pole, which would seemingly support this being an internal process resulting from axial spin. So I don't want to discount that idea. However, this may also conversely indicate that the central spot in Earth and Moon's fault systems, Fiji and Copernicus, were actually in an axial position around which both rotated at one point in their early past. The second possibility is that an external action acted on both surfaces to create this pattern, and that the external force was each other. This seems more plausible to me. However, the second possibility doesn't actually preclude the first. And so, I would propose that this molding of the crusts likely occurred at this nexus while it was the axial pole for both the Earth and Moon for a short time. In effect, the Earth and Moon would have been spinning together in an hourglass-like configuration that met at Earth's south pole. However, at that time, the South Pole would have been at the center of the Pacific. The land formations that resulted from repetitive plasma arc discharges between the Earth and Moon would have thus occurred in a predictable vortex pattern, which we find. This would make it both an internal and an external process, almost like the molding of a child's personality by interacting with its parents. Of course, this configuration couldn't have lasted for long, and probably fairly quickly the Moon drifted northward to Earth's equator, where it is happiest because the Earth's spin is fastest. Regardless of how the Moon initially came into being, I propose that in the early days of the Moon and Earth, while they were still molten plasma balls, just beginning to cool, that the Moon approached the Earth many times, and in effect rounded it out and baked the Earth's surface to create the crust, as well as the lunar mares. To reiterate my original thesis, I postulate that the mares represent the Moon's surface that became plasma while approaching the Earth, and that this represents echoes of the process of the Moon escaping Earth's gravity by shedding mass. This also explains why we see lower elevations in the lunar mares as opposed to higher elevations for volcanic eruptions on Earth. It is readily conceded in scientific circles that neither the heavy bombardment impact thesis nor the lunar volcanism hypothesis of lunar mare formation can explain all the evidence found on the Moon. Beau Theory offers a way to explain the evolution of both the Moon's and Earth's surfaces, as well as explain the mysteries of Earth's plate tectonics. With these numerous alignment in the contours of the fault lines of the Earth and Moon, the correspondence of Pacific islands to lunar craters on the Oceanus Procellarum, and the correspondence between continental land formation and lunar mare shapes, I believe this thesis has ample support for serious consideration to replace, or at least modify, the giant impact hypothesis. The evidence will show that this process was also initially responsible for the raising of Earth's early supercontinents. The giant tidal effects of a close moon could have easily sifted early Earth's material and effectively raised the Earth's crust. I believe that this theory allows for enough crustal mixing to account for the availability of water on the Moon currently. This process may have created or contributed to Earth's water and oceans. That is, unfortunately, further back than I can discern via the physical evidence. However, it seems a reasonable conclusion. In these exchanges, a lot of material is being mixed and sent back and forth, and this was probably how water on Earth formed. Since the temperatures involved in this process wouldn't have been as high as in a giant impact and less evenly distributed, the more volatile elements could remain on the Moon, even if most of them were eventually lost to the low gravity. It may sound incredible, but it also appears the craters of the Oceanus Procellarum show a high degree of correspondence to the early plate divisions of the supercontinent Pangea before it broke up. This naturally depends on which imaginary map of Pangea one uses, but the map below seems simple enough to be accurate to me, and when overlaid, a clear pattern emerges of lunar craters straddling continental boundaries and fault lines. It also makes intuitive sense to me that a moon in low orbit would be capable of exerting the forces necessary to break up the continents. Therefore, I speculate that if this process started over the Pacific, the first land masses and supercontinents would have coalesced on the opposite side of Earth, at the North Pole. Afterwards, an imbalance of the Earth's mass created by this would have broken the Earth's tidal locking at the Pacific, and subsequently led to the Moon to begin to drift into orbit as Earth began rotating on its own. The Moon was still too heavy at this point to escape low orbit, and as it is today, it remained tidally locked to the Earth. Thus, a rounding out process occurred that involved individual mare impacts, which broke up the supercontinent. It appears this may have also been how the Moon lost its strong magnetic field. During these approaches, the Moon must have shed immense amounts of crustal iron and other material on its near side to the Earth, which then went into orbit or fell back to Earth. This would help to explain the difference in crustal composition and thickness between the near and far sides of the moon. I further speculate that the material then became the recurrent cyclical near-Earth orbiting asteroids that come close to Earth and which have caused cyclical catastrophes in the past. But that is a theory for another time. It's important to note that I have assumed that the later approaches of the moon to Earth show the most residual congruence. With that in mind, I find the Americas demonstrate the most compelling evidence of the moon's impacts, and why I believe they were the final place of the moon's departure. I believe I have uncovered most of the beginning and the end of this Earth-Moon interaction. However, many details regarding the middle of the story still need to be clarified, so forgive me for the briefness of the outline I present next. I'm just getting my material into presentations, and it takes a lot of time. I have traced the final course of the moon before exiting low orbit northward from the Amazon basin to the Gulf of Mexico to Texas, across North America to the Hudson Bay, Canadian basin, and around the North Pole, before being bumped up and away by Greenland. It may have become tidally locked over the North Mid-Atlantic Ridge at Tycho on the moon for some time after that. However, that is speculation at this point. I see circumstantial evidence that this final act of the process did not actually occur until approximately 1 billion years ago, as the precursor to the epoch of Snowball Earth. This idea needs further vetting, but it's based on the current dating of the lunar ray craters, including Copernicus, which is dated at 800 million years old, roughly coinciding with Snowball Earth's onset 850 million years ago. It appears the moon's approach began in the southern hemisphere, near the South Pole, at the confluence of what was then South Africa, Antarctica, and perhaps parts of Indonesia, and later drifted over the Pangea supercontinent and broke it up. At this point, any trained geoscientist will likely object, since Pangea is thought to have existed roughly 300 million years ago. I want to acknowledge this incongruence and admit that if I'm correct in most of my assumptions, the early timeline of Earth will be quite different when we are done. And leave it at that for now. Evidence indicates the moon's path before leaving Earth's close proximity involved a complicated dance of pole tipping and electromagnetism, mixed with its closest approaches to Earth and its greatest shedding of material from the Mare Imbrium and the Oceanus Procellarum. If my hypothesis is correct, this final journey northward to the pole would have involved a massive pole shift and crustal displacement, which consequently defined the Earth and Moon's final axial tilts. It also provided the extra magnetic oomph to propel the Moon away and the angular momentum to get the Earth spinning fast enough for the Moon to escape low Earth orbit. I believe this was the primary cause of the first ice age, as well as the subsequent massive flooding from the impacts at the Hudson Bay and the Canadian basin. The ice age would have been initially caused by the massive amounts of storms in the area of North America between the Earth and Moon as they neared each other before impact. The melted material from these impacts could have easily then caused the worldwide flood catastrophists see evidence of today. This would adequately explain the pattern of pole shifting and why we find worldwide flood evidence. The Earth's crust would have likely shifted south in western North America and north in East Africa. The two nexus at which the Earth remains at the equator during this process are in Indonesia and near the northern tip of South America, both of which show a gyration landmass pattern from past pole shifts. Furthermore, if we concede that some of this material ejected into space from these impacts then became the recurrent asteroid and cyclically returned to Earth, we can tie together these areas with later impacts that cause similar but lesser damage. Large pieces still exist that may be catastrophic, but we can infer that the largest threats have decreased in frequency over time. I say this because I find evidence that the small meteorite showers we experience today on Earth are actually on the periphery of these events. I have already begun gathering preliminary evidence that this is true by correlating maps of recent and known prehistoric impact sites. Here is the Texas map from above with recent meteorite impacts in red and older ones in blue. I really want to tie this final thought to Ben Davidson's last book on catastrophism, but I'll have to save that for another time. Unless you are familiar with his work, it wouldn't be very fruitful. For those who are, there's something special for you to consider I'll ask Ben to share. If you aren't familiar with his work, I absolutely recommend you buy his new book, you start following his YouTube channel and watching his videos at Suspicious Observers. To end this video where I began my journey, I believe the evidence shows that the moon created the scarring of a giant worldwide flood that emanated from its impacts at the Hudson Bay and Canadian Basin before finally leaving low Earth orbit. I believe the approach at the Hudson Bay would have been into a massive glacier, which was subsequently vaporized. The effects of this massive water vaporization would have been incredibly explosive and likely enough to spin the moon into magnetic opposition that then allowed it to circle the North Pole and be propelled away. The Hudson Bay impact would have decimated North America, but the Canadian Basin impact would have likely struck the Pacific Ocean the hardest, with tsunamis emanating from the north. This would have washed away all the low-lying islands of the Pacific, down past Australia, around Africa, and then northward into the Atlantic. Due to the effects of the early approaches that had already established Earth's dual mantle plume, the nature of all future crustal displacements had also already been set, and so at this point the tipping of North America could have easily occurred. I deduced this by examining the latest maps of magma mantle plumes and adjusting for continental drift. I hypothesized that the moon's approach began over what is now South Africa. As we see here, the largest mantle plumes closest to the surface is in South Africa, while another large area is in the Pacific near Fiji, as well as under the Hudson Bay and Canadian basins. As Earth's crust, oceans, and spherical shape coalesced, the moon was subsequently drawn more towards the northern hemisphere. I speculate this was due to the loss of the moon's initially much stronger magnetic field as it lost more of its iron mass. At that point, the Earth's structure finally had the stability to push the moon away magnetically. The Earth's ability to shift its crust while maintaining core polarity also likely aided in this process. Finally, I cannot stress enough my belief that the remnants of these encounters blasted into space may well be the asteroids and meteoroid belts Earth cyclically encounters each year, as well as some of the giants we only encounter at intervals of hundreds or thousands of years. Just this week, I saw a new report that an asteroid orbiting Mars has the same chemical signature as the moon, and it's believed to be a piece that was somehow blasted off and then settled into Mars' orbit. I believe this asteroid is in fact a remnant of the process that I'm describing here, and that it lends credence to my theory. I will discuss the implications of this part of Beau Theory more in a later video, but I believe it points to an important prediction that could be tested to prove one of the thesis points of Beau Theory. I predict astronomers will find other asteroids with the moon's composition in the near future, and once we start plotting their trajectories and tracing their histories, we will discover conclusive evidence to support Beau Theory, as well as a preliminary understanding of how to forecast asteroid and meteoroid impacts on Earth. It is impossible at this point to say how long each of these approaches or the entire process would have taken. Time on Earth is an inconsistent variable in this equation, and it must be assumed that days were much shorter and Earth's spin was much greater, but also that the relationship evolved through time. We know that the Earth's days are shorter the closer the moon is to it, but visualizing how that relationship evolved over time is a bit complex. The problems of time analysis is further compounded by the irregular patterns of Earth and moon's physical shapes, as well as their changing axial tilts. Therefore, these timelines can only be really worked out properly using supercomputer simulations. The evidence of this process seems more conclusive the more it is studied, and I continue to build my argument with more and more correlated data points and evidence. Yet, while this solution beautifully answers countless mysteries, it also raises countless more. To begin with, it's still very unclear whether this evidence occurred after an accretion of the moon, after an earlier real impact, or whether, alas, discredited George Darwin was perhaps correct, and the moon did somehow split off from the Earth at the Pacific. In many ways, the evidence in the Pacific appears to revive and lend support to his theory. I felt I would be remiss to ignore that. Thus, in order to address a theory that has been fully discredited, I was forced to completely reimagine the Earth-Moon fission process. I did come up with some creative solutions to the problems inherent in the theory, but it's even more complicated than what I've already described, so it needs vetting and more reflection before I release it for peer review. Therefore, I consider it part of a separate theory, and I will not be going into it here. At this point, I want to thank you for listening and invite you to subscribe and comment below with your thoughts. I sincerely appreciate any constructive feedback, but please be warned, I also block negativity trolls like a 6-lane bridge. I understand all the places where this goes against conventional wisdom. I don't need it reiterated. However, if you have a physics degree and can disprove anything, that's cool. For those of good fortune, I would greatly appreciate your subscribing to my Patreon and helping me to quit my day job so that I can work on this full time. Right now, my day job is the biggest stumbling block to finishing this work because I simply don't have the time. With even a little bit of stable monthly support, I could gladly live like a monk and would finish my work within 6 months to a year. So don't be afraid to contribute a small amount on a monthly basis. It would really help.